Hi, I'm David Watson, the founder and CEO of RentVision. When I talk with executives in the multifamily industry, one of the first things we ask them when working with one of their apartment communities is, what do you want your target occupancy to be? And I get two answers often. One answer is, we want to be 100%. Now, 100% is unrealistic and it's not going to happen. This literally means every time somebody moves out, you expect a new resident to move in the very next day. And you've got to clean units, you've got to do maintenance on units, all kinds of things to get them ready. This is impossible, and it demotivates your staff because they know it's impossible and they don't have a realistic number to shoot for. The second answer I get, and this is the answer that I hear most often, is 95%. We want to be 95%. The problem with this answer is there's no thinking behind it. There's no math reasoning, and we really don't know if it's going to optimize the performance of that property. It's merely based on somebody's feelings about what makes them feel good from a profitability standpoint. The real question is, what target occupancy is going to optimize performance? Now, one thing I want to point out before diving into answering this question is that seasonality comes into play in optimizing performance. For example, if you're in the month of May and you have an apartment community that's 93% occupied, you're not nearly as panicked as if you're in the month of November, right before Thanksgiving, and that same apartment community is 93% occupied. 93% in May isn't as big of a deal because you rent a lot of units in the spring and the summer. 93% in November is a really big deal because you don't rent very many units in the wintertime. So seasonality comes into play, and we have a metric called future occupancy target that takes into account a community's unique seasonality, and we'll talk about that in a future video. But in this video, what we're talking about is our annual target occupancy, or ATO for short. This is the occupancy target that we're shooting for over an entire year, hence the word annual. We know this will adjust for seasonality reasons, but we want to know, what is your target for the entire year? Now, diving in, how do we use math and metrics to set a very helpful and valuable ATO for your community? The first thing we need to do is look at the two metrics that determine our TTM, or trailing 12 months occupancy. That would be our occupancy over the last year, or an annual occupancy. There's two key metrics that go into this. The first one is your turnover percentage. The more units that turn over at your community, the more vacancy that you would have had over the last year, and thus the lower your occupancy would be. But that's unfortunately not enough to know how much vacancy you experienced. The second thing you need to know is how many vacant days were between move out and move in. Every time one resident moves out and you rent that unit and the next resident moves in, how many vacant days were there? So the more units that went through a turnover and the more days that you had between move out and move in means more vacancy, and thus you had a lower trailing 12-month occupancy. But we can go one step further. When we look at the vacant days between move out and move in, we actually want to break this into two different components. The first metric is days before a rental application comes in, and specifically we'll look at the vacant days before a rental application comes in. And second would be the days after a rental application comes in. So we can see it on our timeline down here. Somebody moves out of a unit, maybe it's vacant for 20 days, then we receive a rental application and that unit becomes leased. Then 21 days later, the residents that turned in the rental application move in. This was vacant for 41 days, 20 days of vacancy before the rental application, 21 days after the rental application. Now, this begs an obvious question. Why would we break these two metrics apart? We think it's really important to break these apart to give you the pieces of information you need to know how to improve your occupancy. For example, if this number, 20, is too big the days before receiving a rental application, lowering your price can shrink it. Improving your marketing can help this number. There's all kinds of things you can do. But if you think 21 days is too long between receiving a rental application and the move-in, spending more money on marketing isn't going to improve that. Lowering your rental price isn't going to improve that number. Instead, you would need to focus on things like your hold policy. How long can leasing agents hold units for new residents? So we want to break these numbers apart because when we're setting our annual target occupancy, knowing where our problems are really helps us determine what our future can be. So RentVision actually invented what we call our ATO, or Annual Target Occupancy Calculator, that allows you to plug in some numbers of your performance and set a very helpful annual target occupancy. So let's dive into that calculator right now with a real example. The first thing we're going to do with our ATO calculator is input our turnover percentage. In this case, it's 50%. Now you'll notice on the ATO calculator that our maximum ATO is listed at 100%. The reason it's listed at 100% is because we're not showing any vacant days between move out and move in yet. Once we plug in some vacant days there, that'll change. So the next line that we're going to look at is the average number of vacant days from app to move in. We're going to plug in 21. Now you'll notice on the right side our maximum ATO drops to 97.12%. These are the only two metrics that are needed to calculate our maximum ATO. As we look at our board, what we can see is we've plugged in 21 days here between rental app and move-in, and we've plugged in a turnover rate of 50%. These are the only two numbers that are needed to get our maximum ATO. We actually will assume our days before receiving a rental app is 0. In other words, we expect you to pre-lease 100% of your units. But there's still a maximum ATO of 97.12%. So if you pre-lease 100% of your units, you still can't achieve an annual target occupancy above 97.12% because you're still going to experience vacant days between residents, and 50% of your units are still turning over. So it doesn't make sense to set an annual target occupancy higher than this because you're not going to change your pricing or increase your digital ad spend and improve any performance here. You need to actually improve the actual performance of your turnover rate or the days between getting a rental application and moving in. And there's other more managerial decisions that could be made for that. So moving back to the calculator, we're going to plug in our trailing 12-month occupancy. In this case, it's 94.38%. Notice when we plug this number in, it sets your minimum ATO on the right side of the calculator. And it happens to be the exact same number as your trailing 12-month occupancy, 94.38%. Now, why would we put that in there? You know, oftentimes we see people's trailing 12-month occupancy be 96, 96.5%, and they set their annual target occupancy at 95%. What they're telling us is they want to perform worse than how they've performed in the last year. Now, unless you're willing to raise rents, which we'll talk about here shortly, that's really not a good aim. Think about a bow and arrow. And when you're aiming at a target, and if you hit high, you're going to aim lower. And if you hit low, you're going to aim higher. This is what an annual target occupancy is. It's a true target. If you're only willing to lower rents or increase digital ads when you're below target, but you're not willing to raise rents or cut your digital ad spend when you're above target, then you really have a minimum occupancy threshold, not an annual target occupancy. So we need to think about this in terms of a target, and that's why our minimum is set as what our actual historical occupancy has been. Now, as we move back to the calculator, the very first subjective question comes up. Are you willing to raise rents? In this case, with a trailing 12-month occupancy of 94.38%, I don't think it makes sense to raise rates. So I'm going to leave the answer as no for the time being. Next, we have our fourth and final data point from our actual numbers. It's the average number of vacant days from move out to app. And I'm going to plug in 20 because we have 20 days over the last year for this particular community's average. Now we get to the next subjective question. What is your goal for the average number of vacant days from move out to app? Now you'll notice I'll look and see, hey, I've been averaging 20, so maybe I want to set my goal at 15. And you'll see that your recommended ATO jumps from 94.38% to 95.07%. Because I've set this as my target to improve my ATO beyond what my trailing 12-month occupancy has been. Now, if I set this number to 10, now this number is probably unrealistic. I'm actually expecting to cut in half my vacant days from move out to receiving a rental application from 20 to 10. Now you'll notice my ATO jumps to 95.75%, but I really need to ask myself, is it reasonable to cut in half the amount of time it takes to rent a unit? And that may be too big of a jump. I potentially should just leave it at 15. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is this is a great way to think about setting your ATO because you have this goal of how many vacant days you want a unit to sit before it receives a rental application. So if we want it to sit for just 15 days here, now we have an achievable, attainable target for our leasing agents in all scenarios. For example, let's say your community is sitting at 98 or 99%. It's easy for your leasing agents to sit back and relax, pat themselves on the back with how good they're doing. But if they're at 99% and there's a unit that's available, they know, I need to get it rented within 15 days. They still have a target to shoot for. And the same thing is true if you have a whole bunch of notices coming and they all move out, you still have targets to shoot for even if your occupancy is low. So I really love this one number of how many days do we expect a unit to sit vacant and unrented before we get a rental application on it. Now, let's actually go back to our calculator and look at a different scenario. In this scenario, we're going to say this community has a 35% turnover rate. Their average number of vacant days from app to move-in is 20. Their trailing 12-month occupancy is 97.03%. And their average number of vacant days from move-out to app is 11. Now, with this trailing 12-month occupancy of 97.03%, we're going to click yes to the question, are you willing to raise rents? We think we're willing to raise rents with that kind of an occupancy level. And another question appears that we need to answer. How much will your turnover rate increase? Now I'm going to plug in 15% here because it's a good rule of thumb to target maybe a 50% turnover rate. And we're at 35%, so we think it might go up about 15%. Then we look down and we set a new goal for the average number of vacant days from move out to app. I'm actually going to plug in 15 because I think our leasing velocity is going to slow down from 11 days to 15 as we raise our rents. Now you'll notice our ATO is set to 95.21%. This means we think our annual occupancy over the next year will decline by 1.82% from our trailing 12-month occupancy over the last year. So I know I need to raise my rents a little bit more than that. So probably 2, 3, 4, 5%. If I can raise my rents that much, I'm going to win from a revenue standpoint, and my property is going to perform that much better. Thanks for watching this video on how to set your annual target occupancy. If you want to access the calculator, download our latest ebook, Best Practices for Multifamily Revenue Management. In there, you'll read a whole section on how to set your annual target occupancy, and there'll be a link to the ATO calculator that we showed you in this video, so you can plug in your actual data and use it. And of course, if you're ever interested, we'd love to work with you and serve your community. We can integrate with most of the accounting softwares out there, pull in your real data, give you real numbers, and help you set a really helpful annual target occupancy to optimize the performance of your property so we can make appropriate changes to your ad budgets, your specials, your website, and so much more. Thanks for watching.